I have spent hours in the Burger King at Joint Base Andrews, which is where Air Force One lives and where Barack Obama liked to golf. Hours there without ever glimpsing the president. Um,
Did you glimpse a burger though?
you know what? I ate my feelings, so I think I had 3 waffles that day.
Well, here we are, another edition of The President's Path, another wild week in Washington, and it's not over yet. And this week, Sumi is in Germany. She's been covering the German elections. So I am delighted to introduce our guest host today, Olivier Knox. He is the senior national correspondent and the anchor of Decision Points with US News and Report, and a long-time watcher of the White House, former president of the White House Correspondents Association, and a long-time friend of mine as well. So great to have you here, Olivier.
Nice to see you.
We're recording this, we'll just say, very late on Thursday Eastern time, just to timestamp that for everyone that's tuning in to show where we're at. And we're a bit late because I was late getting back from the White House, dashing from Pebble Beach after that visit of the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Olivia, you'll remember all of those days over the years and things running late and the chaos around the White House.
Actually, with the timestamp, you're doing pretty well because many a night of covering the White House from my glamorous veal pen in the media workspace, I wasn't getting out until, I don't know, 2, 3 hours later.
For a president who's only, a month and a week into his administration, he's had quite a lot of world leaders come through.
He's got an ambitious agenda, and part of that agenda is to meet with all these world leaders. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say some of these world leaders, they're the ones who need the visit. Macron came here because he wanted to reshape the president's opinion of Ukraine. The prime minister did the same thing, and they both used classic tactics for managing Donald Trump. Macron poured on the charm. Starmer, I thought, was really smart and handed Trump an invitation from the king, and then he played it up as an unprecedented second state visit. And you could see Trump smile and nod and just be very pleased that he was going to make some history.
Bernd, what did you think of that moment? I mean, we kind of anticipated there'd be some element of the royal family or a visit or an invitation, but it was really a kind of masterstroke the way Sir Keir Starmer pulled the envelope from his inside pocket, almost the first thing he did when he got into the Oval Office.
And I think that was a smart move, and that it kind of set up the tone of the rest of the day, in which Sir Keir kind of went out of his way to for there not to be at least any public disagreement between the two men. There was a lot of lavish praise being thrown back and forth. When there was questions later on in the press conference that in theory, for example, he was asked about Canada and Trump's efforts to make Canada a 51st state, supposedly. He went out of his way to say, you're trying to divide us when there is no division, essentially. And I think, giving him that letter at the outset, kind of probably put Trump in quite a good mood. And this is very much a president that operates on mood and instinct. So I think that was very kind of astute move to kind of set up the rest of the day with something like that.
What struck me as well, and I saw a similar thing happen with President Macron on Monday, whereas that chat before they'd had their substantive bilateral was quite jokey and touchy-feely and very lovely and all of that. And then they had their bilateral, they came out to the press conference, and almost the first thing President Trump said was, this guy's a really tough negotiator.
Prime Minister Starmer, you've been terrific in our discussions. You're a very tough negotiator, however. I'm not sure I like that, but that's okay. Very, very special person.
And it was something similar with Macron. There was a slight change, still very warm and everything, but slight change of tone after they'd had those substantive arrangements. Now, obviously, we don't know what goes on inside the Oval Office when we're all thrown out as much as we would love to. But it seems to be that they've been really pushing President Trump in private, but striking a slightly different tone in public.
I thought this afternoon was almost noticeable that President Trump seemed much more subdued, perhaps even tired in the afternoon than in the morning, which perhaps speaks to the intensity of the things they were discussing and behind closed doors. But I also think in his mind, saying that someone's a tough negotiator, as someone who even frames foreign policy repeatedly all the time as deals being made. I think in his mind, there's probably no higher compliment than being a tough negotiator, because that's also what he says about himself very often.
Olivier, how did you think President Macron worked out with his visit? I know you keep a keen eye on French affairs.
The thing about Macron is he agrees with Donald Trump on a lot of really important things. The idea that Europe needs to militarize more, spend more on defense, take more responsibility for its own security. If Macron pitched that to Donald Trump behind the scenes, that would have pleased Donald Trump immensely. He's called Donald Trump a game changer in public for Ukraine and for European security. So there's a lot of stuff that Macron has already said that if he repeated it to Donald Trump, it would have a fairly big effect.
And we heard those similar comments from Starmer as well. We heard him say, and I can't remember now which of the press conferences it was, that he said the same thing, Europe needs to step up more. Obviously, just days before coming here, he announced that the UK defence spending was going to go up to 2.5%, which President Trump said, oh, well, I'd like to see that go up to 4 or 5%. So there's always a pushing ahead of the goalposts, I guess. But it's interesting in terms of this approach that world leaders are taking to how they come to President Trump, how they come to those meetings and what they say, and just really careful measuring of the language.
The number of times that world leaders have talked among themselves before one of them comes to talk to Donald Trump is also really interesting. It's also very public, but it's really interesting. You've got these calls. There were a bunch of calls before Macron came over. There were a bunch of calls before the Prime Minister came over. I think that's very interesting. It's like a team effort almost to see, well, how should we approach this problem? We need him to. We need an American role in the security guarantees supporting this notional peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. How do we get that? Okay, well, I'll make this point to him. I'm imagining here, I'm speculating.
Yeah.
But it seems like they've divvied up the job and agreed on a tone and a message to use at 1600 Pennsylvania. And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, it really feels like a pincer movement, doesn't it? I mean, we were told as well there are many calls between Zelensky and Macron before the Macron meeting. For sure, Starmer and Macron spoke. I think Starmer said he'd spoken to 13 leaders or something in advance of the visit. Starmer will most definitely be speaking to Zelensky before that meeting. And then they all regroup back in London on Sunday as to kind of how they take their interactions forward into whatever happens next. Because, we have to say, really, there is no peace deal between Russia and Ukraine at this point. All of the talk about a security backstop, President Zelensky wants in a deal before agreeing a deal, but President Trump is saying, no, you've got to get your deal first before I can bring any conversation in around American troops or peacekeepers or anything like that. So it's a kind of chicken and egg type situation, and it's going to be really interesting to see, I think, when all those meetings are over, what happens next and who comes to the table. We haven't even mentioned the EU, who are really annoyed at what's going on and how they feel they've been left out of it. Their chief diplomat, Kaja Kallas, was in town this week, supposed to meet Secretary Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State. That meeting was called off due to scheduling commitments a few hours beforehand. I interviewed her on my show this week, and, she was kind of saying the relationship between the EU and the US is really complicated now. It's really challenging to have these conversations, and the meeting gets cancelled. What do you do? And she said the talking points from the US is the Russian narrative. And maybe that's some kind of grand master plan, she said, on behalf of President Trump. But for us, if Russia is going to get things it asked for without shifting its position at all, that feels like appeasement. So kind of very strong words coming from the EU towards the US, and there's no, formal negotiations even underway at this point.
Well, and Trump's response was to say that the EU had been designed to screw, that's his word, the United States. So those relationships, that's a tense relationship.
And around about the time that Secretary Rubio was due to be meeting Kaja Kallas, he was actually in this big cabinet meeting, which was the other major event of the week, this first cabinet meeting that Donald Trump held with his team. They're not all confirmed yet, but most of them are. And that was, again, extraordinary, like to take questions from the press for, I think it was 60 minutes or so before
65 minutes.
65 minutes,
Yeah.
minutes, with all the cabinet secretaries, so much power essentially in a room, and the president going around all the journalists taking all the questions. And the other remarkable thing, of course, about that was Elon Musk. Not elected, not Senate confirmed. We don't know what kind of security clearance he has. And he was there addressing journalists as well, and we're told stayed in the room for the duration of that cabinet meeting as well.
And I thought there was a remarkable moment there in the cabinet meeting when the journalists were asking, about tensions that had been reported between some of the cabinet members and Elon Musk over Doge and some of the cuts that have been made. And President Trump kind of turned to the room and said, would anyone like to speak, kind of inviting people to, criticize Musk in any regard. And it was crickets. There was total silence. And I thought that was, a very, kind of a unique way that you don't see very often in America, at least, of kind of him, establishing that he is very much the boss in the room. And one wonders, behind closed doors, whether some of those discussions didn't become a little more heated. To some of the cabinet members are obviously less enthused with Doge, and some have instructed employees not to reply to the emails for now, for example. So I just thought that was quite a remarkable moment, especially when Musk is there as not a member of the cabinet, and he, noticeably not a member of the cabinet, even dressed in a T-shirt that said tech support to kind of highlight that.
Actually, someone mentioned that to me from the Republican Party. They said, the cabinet meeting is a very formal affair. Everyone was there in their suits. And then you have this guy at the end in a T-shirt and a baseball cap kind of sipping from a tiny little teacup or an espresso cup as he went through it. It was quite extraordinary.
It was. I would note that none of the cabinet secretaries who've been reported to have tensions with Elon Musk decided to dispel them at this meeting. It's not like none of them rode to his notional rescue in this cabinet setting. They all kept studiously quiet.
The other thing at that cabinet meeting as well was the discussion of the Trump gold cards, which is something I haven't heard an American president talking about before. And President Trump actually ceded the floor to his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, to describe these Trump gold cards, which are a gold green card, it seems, where a foreign national can pay $5 million and they get what seems like, I don't know if you guys have seen any formal detail on this, but based on what Howard Lutnick was saying, it gets them a green card for life that's not attached to anything in particular. The president referred to it being a solid pathway to citizenship, and he was talking about if they could sell 10 million of these, that it would wipe the debt out.
I thought that was fascinating. Just because, I cover immigration quite a bit too, that this was, a pathway to citizenship and very much an immigration policy. But the way it was framed in the meeting, at least, was completely economic, that if they sell X amount of these gold cards, they'll get, I think they said at one point, $1 trillion, to pay down the national debt. So it was interesting to hear him speak about immigration policy, but in economic terms, because on the other hand, when he speaks about the wider, immigration policies of the U.S., for example, his mass deportation drive, that's not framed in an economic sense. That has an economic impact, but he always frames it as kind of a national security and kind of sometimes public health issue. It's different. It's interesting to see the different framing of those two opposite sides of the immigration coin.
I'm glad you mentioned not seeing a final proposal. That's always important with the Trump White House, any Trump White House, because they portray them one way, and then the final proposal doesn't necessarily comport with the language that you've been hearing for a while. I thought what's interesting is these seem to be geared to very, very rich people in India and in China, because there are green card limits, and this essentially is an end run around the limits on immigration from these countries. I don't want to be excessively cynical, but it would seem to open the door to folks from Russia coming to the United States if they pay $5 million. We just don't have the kinds of details. Green cards come with what I'll call, I guess, a criminal limit. If you are known to have committed certain crimes, you can't really get a green card. Didn't hear that in the gold card discussion. But again, we haven't heard much. We haven't seen. There's no legislation in front of us where we can say, this is what this confers on this deep-pocketed individual, and we're really going to have to look at that carefully.
It was interesting. He was actually asked specifically about letting in when he first mentioned the gold cards in the Oval Office earlier in the week. He was specifically mentioned about, would this apply to Russian oligarchs? And he certainly didn't say no. He said, well, maybe. I mean, I like some Russian oligarchs. They don't have as much money as they used to. But he certainly didn't say no, which I thought was very telling. Given that the war is still happening and that some of these sanctions are still in place. I thought that was kind of an interesting glimpse into his worldview.
And there was also, Bernd, I know you were keeping an eye on this, this kind of notion of a migrant registry was floated this week.
There was, and it's actually quite a significant announcement that they made. It was just a bit drowned out by everything else that was happening. But essentially what they asked is that any undocumented migrant in the U.S. register, and that's not something that's happened since 1940. This is something that's just kind of a very foreign concept. I think it'll be very hard to implement. It's very hard.
Who's going to sign up for that when you hear
Exactly.
the hard line on deportations and so on?
Exactly, but I think it's also reflective of the fact that we're hearing less and less about immigration from the administration. I think that's probably because President Trump and Tom Homan, for example, has explicitly said he's not happy with the pace of deportations. And in their view, this could help because it broadens the pool of people that could potentially be deported. But to actually make that work, strikes me as fairly impossible. I was speaking to a few undocumented people right after this, and they said there's just no way. Why would I do that? So there's a lot of questions left. I think this is, again, another example of the announcement coming before the details of how would one compel an undocumented migrant to essentially potentially set themselves up for deportation. If you give your address and fingerprints and you're in the system, it just makes the whole process much more straightforward from the government's end. I think it's very difficult for that to happen, but it shows that he had seen immigration as a huge win, and now it's kind of losing steam a bit for the administration. They're trying to inject some new life into that.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, that's something that kind of slipped by a little bit this week, given everything else that was going on, because, not to focus on ourselves and the media here, but it is quite challenging to keep up with everything that's going on in the Trump administration. Like, the pace has just been quite extraordinary in this, month and a week or so that he's been in office. But there was a huge development this week in terms of media relations between the White House and the journalists who covered the White House Correspondents Association. Olivier, you're obviously a past president of that. Do you want to talk through a little bit about just what was announced this week by the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt?
Sure. So the White House Correspondents Association exists essentially to represent the interests of the White House press corps, try and regularly fail to forge a consensus, for collective action by the press in relations to the White House, advance First Amendment principles and the like. But the day-to-day job is that negotiation for, how many reporters can we get into this event to observe the president firsthand do his job.
Moving forward, the White House press pool will be determined by the White House press team.
What they said this week was that they would take control over who was in this pool. And they seized that control from the WHCA, from this journalist organization, which had controlled it for decades, for basically as long as it existed. It's a really significant blow to press freedoms in the United States. One of our principles is that a president doesn't get to pick who covers them. You know, he's trampled on that now. This is after booting just the Associated Press, which is probably one of the most important press outlets in the United States, booting them out of the day-to-day work of the pool because he doesn't like that they are still using Gulf of Mexico instead of using his Gulf of America.
And I suppose we should say, Olivier, when we're talking about the White House Correspondents Association, if you're to listen to how the Trump administration describe it, you might think that it's all sort of people who are anti-President Trump, or the news organizations, as some in the US do have an agenda that's against Trump, as others have a pro-Trump agenda. Right. But the WHCA is for everyone, no matter your agenda.
Right, that's right. And there's no ideological criterion for joining the WHCA. There's no ideological criterion for joining the pool. As far as I know, no news organization was ever turned away if they applied for the pool, was ever turned away because of ideology. This is just a red herring here. The WHCA controlled access to the pool because we were the representatives of the entire press corps. And there are plenty of outlets, Fox News, Daily Mail, The Blaze, a few others who do regularly do pool duty. So this is not an ideological issue at all.
I thought it was really notable this weekend that some of those conservative news outlets that you just mentioned, both about the AP and then about the WHCA, they were quite vocal in their reservations about what happened, because I think the concern among some of those conservative news outlets is that now a precedent has been set. So in a future Democratic White House, now that this has been done, I mean, in theory, there's really nothing to stop a Democrat-run White House from doing the same and, kind of booting off outlets that it doesn't feel are ideologically aligned with what the White House is saying, and inviting ones that are. So I think it's kind of set a precedent that many reporters on both sides of the political spectrum think is quite dangerous for the future. I mean, once this has been done.
That's not hypothetical. The Obama White House tried to designate Fox News not a real news outlet and exclude them from some coverage, which is one of the reasons that one of the most vocal outlets when it comes to this is Fox News. And kudos to them, by the way, for returning the favor, because it was the press corps and the WHCA that blocked the Obama administration effort to kick them out of White House coverage altogether.
So, Bernd, we've spoken before in the podcast when you've been pooling for President Trump and all the wild and wonderful and interesting things you've been doing. But since this was announced by the press secretary, has it had an impact in the workings in the press briefing room and how information is coming out?
Today was frankly very chaotic, and then most of the day, at least when I got there in the morning, there was a lot of discussion about how does this work? Am I still on pool duty? Who's going to send the reports? I mean, is the listserv still working? And then plus, logistical questions about, like, in the future, for example, how do some of these new media outlets that the Trump administration has, there's a cost associated with going on Air Force One, and there's logistical challenges associated with bringing a pool for kind of a supplemental duty, like a vice presidential event or that sort of thing. It's a huge logistical task that people today at least weren't sure that the White House had really thought through some of those day-to-day questions. There was a huge sense of uncertainty when I walked in the room. It was the only thing anyone was talking about down in my little area of the basement down there.
Well, speaking of freedom of the press, it's time to free the press, free both of you from this podcast. We're all out of time for today for this edition of The President's Path. It's sure been a busy walk yet again. Olivier, great to have you with us for your maiden voyage here. Hopefully we'll have you back again. And Bernd, great as always to chat to you, and see you both soon. And you can catch up with all of the episodes of The President's Path on BBC Sounds and the BBC iPlayer.
Just search The President's Path. It'll be under the Global Story banner for Sounds users.
Each episode will be published at the end of the week, and you can also find us on YouTube.